Okay, thank you everyone for joining the April 2024 meeting. Our speaker is David Pavlik. David is a research assistant from the Haddad Lab at the Kellogg Biological Station at Michigan State University. He has a master's degree in conservation biology from the University of Minnesota, where he studied the effects of fire on butterfly occupancy and floral nectar resources in the Sierra Nevada, California. He's been working with endangered butterflies since 2019, first with the St. Francis Satyr in North Carolina, and now with Poweshiek Skipperling and Mitchell's Satyr in Michigan. David, thank you for joining us and sharing with us tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about one of my favorite topics, and that's endangered butterflies and butterflies in general. So always excited to talk about butterflies with people who are interested in hearing about it. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about some of the conservation efforts that we've been working on here in Michigan for two endangered butterflies, Poweshiek Skipperling and then the Mitchell's Satyr. And you already just got the overview that I was going to give you. My name is Dave Pavlik. I've been working in Nick's lab for the past 6 years. These are just a couple of the photos of some of the work that I've been doing over the past years. Most of my work revolves around captive rearing, captive breeding, and captive population management to eventually get butterflies back out into the wild on the landscape. Working with many, many different partners across the state and even internationally. So we'll get into a little bit of that as we go. If you're not familiar with the two species I'm going to be talking about tonight, the butterfly on the left is the Mitchell's Satyr. The butterfly on the right is the Poweshiek Skipperling. Both of these are endangered butterflies in Michigan. So the Poweshiek Skipperling is the first butterfly that we started working with in Michigan. And we are working very closely with the John Ball Zoo on this project. So as I go throughout the talk, you'll probably hear a lot about the zoo. Historically, Poweshiek Skipperling was found all throughout the Midwest. Really, the core of its range was in North and South Dakota, Minnesota, into Iowa, Wisconsin, and then Michigan. At one point in time, this was one of the most abundant butterflies on the landscape in the Midwest. I've heard stories of them being so common and abundant that even butterfly collectors had no interest in them having in their collection. They wouldn't even swing their nets at them. They weren't interested in them at all just because they were so common. They're found all throughout the tallgrass prairies in the Midwest. And then in Michigan, they use a little different habitat, which is prairie fens. And so it's got this groundwater component that makes them much wetter than those tallgrass prairies in the Midwest. So that's kind of unique to the Michigan population. So all those black dots are areas that are confirmed to have had Poweshiek skipperlings in the past. There's probably, probably extended further. We just didn't know about it at that time. And so those two green dots that just popped up are all that's left for this butterfly. Everything else has been eliminated. We know of no other populations except for one small population in Michigan and one small population in Manitoba, Canada. Pretty interesting that everything in the middle of its range has been eliminated, and really just on the two extremes is where it's now being found. The populations in Manitoba are slightly larger than they are in Michigan. It hasn't always been that way, but Michigan populations the last few years have been in serious, well, they've been declining for a while, but seriously bad the last couple of years. So these are some of the ways that we estimate the population. So Michigan Natural Features Inventory is the entity in Michigan that surveys for these butterflies annually. And they started doing this in 2008. And they survey all occupied sites in Michigan in June and July when the butterfly is flying. Each one of these colored lines is a different population. And so you'll probably notice that it ends at 2019. If you were to extend that axis out, there would be no change, really. It would just be more of the same. So 2009, 2010, and 11, the populations were still pretty good. So this is the number of Poweshieks observed per minute. And so at the peak, it was more than 2 butterflies observed per minute during surveys, which is really good. I don't know of many locations I can go to and survey for butterflies and see more than 2 per minute anymore, unfortunately. But then in 2012 and 2013, especially, we saw massive population crashes. And unfortunately, those populations, once they get down to those low levels, have a really, really hard time rebounding. So another way to look at the surveys and how the populations have changed over time. This is a figure that shows the 2-visit relative abundance. So the maximum of the two highest surveys combined. And as you can see, over time, this does go to 2023 now, the most recent surveys last year. 2022 was by far the worst year that they've ever had. They came very dangerously close to being extirpated in Michigan. We saw a little bit of a rebound in 2023, and I'll kind of go into why that might be the case. But really, really concerning, these trends that we're seeing. And just to expand on that a little bit, in 2022, MNFI, Michigan Natural Features Inventory, only saw 9 wild Poweshiek skipperlings in all of Michigan combined. Came that dangerously close to being extirpated. And then again, that little bump in 2023. So last year, maybe some encouraging news, 39 wild Poweshieks. That's still not great. Those are still really low numbers, and we need to work on that, but at least they're not gone. So why do we think that they crashed so fast across the entire range? What could be causing this? Well, first, habitat destruction. I'm sure you all know. Native prairies, there's now less than 1% of the remaining native prairies in Michigan or in the US that once existed. And so when you take a specialist species that needs those native prairies and you get rid of them, all the species go with it. And so habitat destruction definitely had a negative impact on the species, but there were still sites into the, early 2000s and even further on that were still doing really well. And so what else could have caused those further declines that we saw? When in 2011, 2012, 2013, when we were seeing those massive crashes in Michigan, coincided with when neonicotinoid pesticides were really adopted by agriculture to be sprayed. And this is a really, really nasty insecticide. It affects all insects. And it's usually, in the past, when they first started using it, was sprayed aerially. And that causes a lot of drift. The neonics can get into the waterways and get carried into water bodies. The plants will actually soak it up, and it stays in the plants for years and years and years. This isn't something that just washes away really quickly. And so these are, still present in the environment. There are countries that have actually outlawed the use of neonicotinoids just because of how dangerous they are to wildlife. Unfortunately, we're not one of those countries, but it was, interesting to see that the use of neonics coincided really closely with when some of these other population crashes started happening. We also take into account climatic changes that could be affecting this butterfly. It's staying warmer later into the season. It's getting warmer earlier in the season, in the spring. We don't have as much snowpack anymore as we historically did. And the species overwinters as a caterpillar. It doesn't build a shelter. It doesn't go underground. It doesn't hide in the duff. It's totally exposed on its plant. And snowpack acts as a really, really good insulator. And so when there's that snowpack on the ground with the caterpillar underneath, it's well insulated from really, really cold temperatures or really, really high temperatures. And the humidity remains about 100% under that snow cover. Without that snowpack, these caterpillars are experiencing just the crazy, crazy winter temperatures and humidity fluctuations that we've been having. This winter was by far the weirdest winter that I can ever remember in Michigan. We've had hardly any snow cover. And so there have to be some consequences to that for these caterpillars that are trying to survive over winter. Also, sites in Michigan were concerned about hydrological changes, so altering the waterways that feed these prairie fens. If the waterways are altered and the water changes in these prairie fens, that will completely change the vegetation structure in these prairie fens, which could eliminate the host plants that these butterflies depend on. It could encourage more woody growth and end up, pushing these butterflies out into areas where they can't survive anymore. And then ultimately, after those population crashes, you could see on those charts how the populations kind of hung on for a little bit, but at really low levels. And it's really, really hard for small populations to bounce back after they get knocked down to those low levels. So the small population viability, some of these populations hung on for a little while, but then ultimately succumbed to just their small populations. One bad year is really all it takes at that point. So obviously they got a lot going against them right now. Before we talk about the work that we've been doing to help save the species from extinction, I want to go through the life cycle of this butterfly just to help you understand what I'll be talking about a little later. So this butterfly only has one flight period. It flies as an adult for 2 to 3 weeks in July, and that's it. Very short, abbreviated flight period. And so those butterflies that are on the wing in July have a very short window to mate, lay eggs, and get the next generation going. And so those eggs are laid sometime in July. They hatch into caterpillars, and those caterpillars are slowly feeding. They don't grow a whole lot during their first summer out there. Once they get to late fall, they start entering diapause, which is a period of suspended growth. It's basically the hibernation stage for the caterpillars. They don't eat, they don't move. They basically just stay on their plant and try to survive the winter. Once the spring temperatures start warming up and the days get longer, those caterpillars will then break their diapause. They'll start feeding again until mid-June when they pupate, and then early July become butterflies again. So when I say that we're working with Poweshiek Skipperling butterflies, most of the time I'm actually working with the caterpillars, trying to keep the caterpillars alive. It's a very short window that we have the butterflies. So in 2021, the Haddad Lab that I work in and the John Ball Zoo, which is located in Grand Rapids, Michigan, we formed a working partnership to help save the species from extinction. And we actually joined what's known as the Poweshiek Skipperling International Partnership, which had been doing the same thing for a long time, but they were looking for new partners who could help speed up the recovery for the species. And so in 2021 was our first year working with the species. Minnesota Zoo had been working with Poweshiek Skipperling for longer than we had. They started working with them, I think, in 2012. And their role was always to come to Michigan, collect a few females, get them to lay eggs in captivity, release those females back to the wild, raise those eggs at Minnesota. When they became butterflies again, come back to Michigan and release them back into the wild. So they were doing head starting. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to look at if captive rearing, captive breeding specifically would be suitable for the species. And nobody had ever tried to breed them consistently in captivity before. This was very experimental, but the head starting, while they were releasing butterflies back into the wild, it wasn't a large number every year, and it wasn't having any significant impact on those population surveys that that Michigan Natural Features Inventory was doing. And while that was happening, the populations continued to decline, and the group made a decision that if we're going to save the species, if anything can be done, we're going to have to learn how to breed them in captivity. So that was our goal the first year that we started doing this. We received 32 of those butterflies from Minnesota Zoo. And instead of releasing any, the decision was made that we're going to keep them and see what we can learn about captive breeding for the species. And the reason that we wanted to do this is there's many reasons, but one of them is to maintain an insurance population at the zoos so that if the species does go extinct in the wild, which you saw how close it came, we'll at least have individuals in our ex situ facility that we can continue to work with, continue to build our numbers until we can do really big releases back into the wild, giving them another fighting chance. And so the way that we maintain that insurance population is through that breeding every single year. And with the ultimate goal of augmenting the populations that still exist in Michigan, trying to prevent those last few populations from disappearing, but also eventually doing the first, hopefully, reintroduction for the species, getting it back on the landscape. So a lot at stake in this first year. So how did we do the first year? Well, we had 8 breeding pairs. So this was our first sign that this can work. So those 32 butterflies, half are roughly male, half roughly female. We had 8 successful breeding pairs that we saw at the zoo. So that was a really good indication that, yeah, this might be possible. We collected almost 600 eggs from those individuals that bred at the zoo, which at this point was by far the most eggs that had ever been held in captivity for the species. We share those eggs with Minnesota Zoo, and the reason we do that is for redundancy. So if something terrible happens to our program, a disease runs through it, or our hoop house where we rear these gets hit by a tornado or something that we can't predict, there will still be another institution that's working with them so that we have that redundancy. So it's kind of a fail-safe in a sense. And so from the eggs that we retained at the John Ball Zoo, we had 269 caterpillars hatch, but only 94 of those survived to diapause. So 35%, and that's not a great number. So going into 2022, one of our main goals was to increase that survival rate from hatch to diapause, and we had a few ideas of what we could do to make that better. But still, this was a really good number of caterpillars. This doesn't account for what Minnesota Zoo had. This was more than had ever been in captivity before. So signs were pointing that, this could possibly work. So what did we do in 2022 with those butterflies? From the ones that we had at Minnesota Zoo and John Ball Zoo, we were able to release 102 butterflies back into the wild in Michigan. And remember, 2022 was the year that Michigan Natural Features Inventory only saw 9 wild butterflies on their surveys. So getting 102 butterflies back in the wild seemed like a really big win. It's not a lot of butterflies, especially when you split them between a couple sites, but it was enough to hopefully keep those populations remaining until we can build up our numbers even more and do even more bigger releases. So that was really encouraging. And what was also encouraging is we saw some of the butterflies that we release laying eggs in the wild. And so sometimes those eggs will not be viable. The females will lay eggs if they haven't bred. And so we got permission to collect a few of those from the wild that we saw zoo butterflies laying those eggs, bring them back into our facility and put them in our incubator, and they hatched. So that gives us an indication that our zoo reared animals are interacting with butterflies out there, either ones that are wild or ones that we released, and they're laying viable eggs. So that's all very, very good news, very encouraging for what we're doing. We also retained some butterflies at the zoo to continue building our captive population. So this year we had 17 breeding pairs. We collected almost 1,700 eggs from those females. So each female has laid about an average of 100 eggs for us. Another 78 eggs were collected from wild females. We shared more eggs with Minnesota Zoo. And this year we had 685 caterpillars hatched at our facility and 501 survived to diapause. So we doubled our survival rate from hatch to diapause. 501 caterpillars to diapause just at our facility was way more than ever before. So you can see how through this process of captive rearing and breeding, we can start to increase the number of butterflies we're working with for hopefully really, really large releases the following year. So very good year for us, not great for the ones in the wild, but in 2023, so this past year, from those caterpillars that we were holding over winter, we released over 500 Poweshiek Skipperling butterflies back into the wild in Michigan. That is a huge number of Poweshieks going back out in the wild. There haven't been that many butterflies in all of the populations combined in the US in many, many years. And so what's really cool about that is we got to witness what they were doing again in the wild. And this picture on the right here is of a male and a female that were released on different days at the same site. So the dots correspond with what day they were released. And so the female and male have been surviving out there for several days, found each other, they're mating. And that was witnessed many times this year. We saw a lot of our zoo reared animals laying eggs out there. So we're really, really hopeful for what we're going to see in 2024. With that many butterflies going out, we're really hoping that we'll see a big population increase. So they saw 39 wild butterflies this past year, as I mentioned before. And what's really interesting about that is that the majority of those butterflies were found right around the release locations that we did last year. So we mark where we're releasing all of these butterflies. Michigan Natural Features Inventory saw the majority of these wild butterflies where we did our releases. So that's another indicator that this might actually be able to work. This might be having some benefit. And I think this next year in 2024, we're going to see if releasing that many butterflies will make a difference or not. We continue to build our captive population so that we can do larger releases into the future. We had 30 breeding pairs at the John Ball Zoo this year, 9 more at Minnesota Zoo, so they started doing a little bit of breeding. We had almost 4,000 eggs laid combined between the two facilities. Just at the John Ball Zoo, we had 1,879 caterpillars hatch, and 1,442 of those are now residing right now at the John Ball Zoo. And combined, we have about 1,900 caterpillars with the Minnesota Zoo. So now we've built this from the year 2021, where we started with 32 butterflies, to now through early 2024 with 1,900 caterpillars. Now we can start talking about doing some really large releases and thinking about what that might mean for the future. So our goals for this year are, we're going to continue our breeding and insurance population just in case this weird winter has had a really negative effect on those wild populations. We're going to continue to breed them. We're going to try to increase our numbers. We're hopefully going to be, as long as our survival rates are similar to what they've been in the past, we're going to be releasing a record number of butterflies again this year. And what's really exciting is that this year we're going to try the first ever reintroduction of Poweshiek Skipperling back into the wild in Michigan, into a site where they used to exist. They got pushed out by glossy buckthorn and other invasive species. That area has been completely restored. It looks fantastic for them. So we're really hopeful that we'll be able to start the first ever reintroduction this year. So our goal right now is we're hoping we'll release somewhere around 1,000 butterflies back into Michigan this year. I've kind of alluded to, we mark our butterflies that we release from the zoo with a Sharpie marker so that when Michigan Natural Features Inventory is out doing surveys, they know if they see an unmarked individual, it's a wild butterfly. If they see a butterfly with marks on it, they know that it came from the zoo. And that helps us when we want to see what effect these releases are having, or other things that we're looking at for our butterflies that we're releasing is dispersal distance. How far can these butterflies disperse? What is their survival like? And does their survival differ between the sites where we're releasing them? And what other behaviors are we observing? Do we see them breeding and laying eggs? All of that is very useful information for us, for a species that, their biology is not super well known. The crashes happened so fast that we weren't able to study a lot of this before there weren't very many individuals on the landscape. So we've got big goals for 2024. I'm really happy with, starting with 32 butterflies in 2021 to what we have now. I have to remind myself that was only a couple of years ago. That didn't take very long. And now we're hopefully going to start seeing some fruits of the labor there. One of the other things that I wanted to touch on is we're always concerned about genetic diversity, right, for small populations. And so in the past couple of years, we've started looking at the genetic component of these butterflies that we're working with. And so we track all of the lineages that we brought in from like the females that started these populations that we have now. And so that we're not breeding brothers and sisters together or closely related individuals. But we also wanted to know what our crosses in our zoos are looking like and if we're actually doing anything beneficial or negative to the genetics of the species. And so this is relatively new information that we have that I'm sharing here tonight. But you can see basically what this is showing for the Michigan sites. The Michigan sites have the lowest genetic diversity compared to the Manitoba sites. So makes sense. The Manitoba populations are still doing a little better than Michigan. They're a little larger. And so you'd expect their genetic diversity to be a little higher. But what's really interesting is the butterflies in the middle, the zoo crosses, the ones that we're doing at our facilities are consistently higher heterozygosity, so more genetically variable than the ones in the sites where we originally collected them. So those individuals are very valuable. They have higher genetic diversity than what's out there. So that's another reason we need to get a lot of these butterflies back into the wild to help maintain that genetic diversity. So we're looking at other genetic implications of, what we're doing as well. But I thought this was really interesting observations from the geneticists that we're working with. So because our Poweshiek Skipperling ex situ facility has been so successful, and we wanted to continue working with butterflies in Michigan, Fish and Wildlife Service asked us if we wanted to get involved with another endangered butterfly. And so of course we did. And so that one is the Mitchell Satyr. And this is one that has been reared in captivity for a little while between a couple of facilities, but it's been kind of hit or miss every year with the success of those programs. And so we thought that some of the techniques that we use to rear Poweshiek Skipperlings might also be suitable for Mitchell Satyr. In fact, in a couple of the sites in Michigan, they both used to fly together in the same prairie fens. Unfortunately, they don't anymore. But our goals, so we just started working with Mitchell Satyr last year in 2023. And we had several goals. And one of them was just to refine the captive rearing husbandry for the species so that we can figure out how to get those survival rates higher so that we can release more butterflies and do it consistently on a year-to-year basis. And we were going to try this with northern and southern butterflies, which I'll show here in a second. The reason we want to do this, again, the populations in Michigan are not doing well. They're doing a lot better than Poweshiek, but we're still losing populations in Michigan of Mitchell Satyr. There's a couple that have very, very low numbers that are going to disappear in a year. And so we want to do reintroductions and also population augmentation, very similar to what we've been doing for Poweshiek Skipperling. We're also studying the genetic work for this species, and there's some really, really interesting genetic questions that we are answering with these northern and southern butterflies that we're working with, including thermal research, which I will touch on here in a second too. So this is what the range for Mitchell Satyr looks like. They're only extant now in Michigan, Virginia, North Carolina, Mississippi, and Alabama. So there was a population in New Jersey at one point. Those populations are gone. They're gone from Ohio, Indiana, and Wisconsin. So within the upper Midwest, Michigan now is the only site that these butterflies exist. We mentioned previously, I worked with endangered St. Francis Satyr in North Carolina. That's a subspecies of the Mitchell Satyr. And so I have worked with the species before. That made us feel a little more comfortable, jumping in with the ex situ work right away. But we also are exploring some of those populations in Mississippi and Alabama. So in order to do this, we had to get some new facilities in place at the John Ball Zoo. So we installed a nice big new hoop house in April of 2023. This is our rearing facility. Basically, we do all of the breeding, all of the caterpillar husbandry inside of this hoop house. It's open air. You can see there's a shade cloth over top so it doesn't get too hot. But this gives us the capacity to grow outside of this initial test year. And we feel we have the capacity to rear hundreds of Mitchell Satyrs at this point. So last year in early June, the first flight period for the butterfly down in Mississippi and Alabama, we got permission to collect 5 females from Mississippi and 1 from Alabama. We brought those back up to the John Ball Zoo. We basically collected them early in the early afternoon and drove throughout the night back up to Michigan to get these butterflies in their egg laying enclosures. So we weren't wasting any time. And so there's a very long drive back with these endangered species in the car, driving throughout the night to get them back to John Ball Zoo. But it all went very well. We collected 377 eggs from those Mississippi females and 121 eggs from the one we collected from Alabama. But the hatch rates were not extremely high. 62% is pretty good. We like to see that number higher, closer to 80 if we can. And then it was really weird for the one from Alabama. She originally laid only non-viable eggs, and then eventually they became viable. But at least that gives us something to work with. And so while we were raising those and eggs were hatching and caterpillars were feeding in our hoop house, the Michigan population started flying, and they typically start flying in early July. It overlaps a lot with when Poweshiek Skipperling is flying. And so this is Bill Flanagan. He is the conservation manager for the John Ball Zoo. He's really excited about these butterfly projects. I work with him very closely. And so this is him with our butterfly crew out in the Prairie Fen in Michigan, collecting the butterflies that we were going to be using for the Saxichi program in Michigan. So you can see the habitat very open. It's very similar to Poweshiek Skipperling, what you saw earlier, but it's probably even a little wetter. Very hot. Those 15 females laid 369 eggs and 309 hatched. So we had a much higher hatch rate for those in Michigan. This picture on the right here is one of those females laying those little eggs on the underside of a Carrick stricta blade. You can see the little green blobs there are the tiny little eggs that these butterflies lay. Every day we go through the enclosures to see how many eggs they laid. We collect those eggs and then they go into our incubator. And once they become caterpillars, we get them back on the plants and they initiate feeding. So host plant for this species is Carrick stricta. It's a very, very common sedge throughout the fens in Michigan. They probably eat other sedges too, but we have not done any studies on that yet. So the first Mississippi flight period was in early June. Down in the South, they fly twice and they only fly once in Michigan. And one of the goals of the program is to sync their development. So we tried to slow the caterpillars down from Mississippi by using shade cloths and keeping it nice and cool in our hoop house. Unfortunately, that did not work. And it seems like they're just programmed to go to second flight period, regardless of the temperatures. So our plan then was to breed them in captivity and then raise those offspring to try to sync up with those from Michigan. And we were able to get at least one successful breeding pair. She laid a lot of eggs and we had 95 offspring to work with. The good news is that those caterpillars did synchronize their development with the caterpillars from Michigan. And so we now have 194 of our caterpillars from Michigan are in diapause right now, and 43 of those caterpillars from Mississippi are in diapause right now. And so one of the reasons that we're, I don't have many slides on this because this is still pretty new, but one of the reasons that we're raising both northern and southern caterpillars is, I talked about climate change potentially being a trap for these species up in Michigan. And we don't know how hot these butterflies can handle. We don't know how hot these caterpillars can handle. But we do know that those in Mississippi and Alabama are experiencing much, much hotter temperatures than those in Michigan. And so we did some thermal testing, or we're doing some thermal testing to see just how hot these caterpillars can handle and if there's a difference between those from Mississippi and Michigan. If there is, there's a little bit of genetic data that suggests that the ones from Michigan and Mississippi and Alabama are all the same subspecies and all very closely related. We may be able to breed those populations together and then see if their thermal tolerance or thermal breadth increases to make them more adaptable for those hotter temperatures that we're now seeing in Michigan. So that's really kind of cutting edge. I don't know of any other, research that has been doing that. We're also looking at the genetic differences between all of the populations so that we can be sure just how closely related they are. I did say that there's some limited genetic work, but it wasn't whole genome sequencing. It wasn't very broad. And so we're doing whole genome sequencing for St. Francis Satyr in North Carolina, the Mississippi populations, the Alabama populations, Michigan populations, and I think we even have some old historical specimen DNA from New Jersey to see where that population falls within these range. So we have a lot of really cool postdocs and researchers that we're working with that are doing this research and answering a lot of these questions that we've had for years and we just haven't been able to answer. So this is all really cool cutting edge stuff if you're into that sort of thing. So before I, end the presentation, I do want to say if you want to follow along with what we've been doing, and if you want to follow along with what we're going to be doing or any important updates that we have this brand new Facebook page. It's called the Poweshiek Skipperling International Partnership. So if you like and follow that page, we'll be hopefully posting regular updates. This is brand new as of about a month ago. And so this is where we're hoping that we can post a lot of our updates so that the public can keep up with what we're doing. There haven't been a lot of posts yet because all of our caterpillars are still sleeping for diapause. They haven't really done much yet. But it looks like we'll be taking them out of diapause pretty soon, getting them back on plants. And yeah, hopefully we'll have a lot more updates for everyone at that point. So check that out if you feel like you want to keep up with the work that we're doing. I also have to thank all of our partners. This is just a limited number of our partners that we're working with. The Poweshiek Skipperling International Partnership is huge. I don't know of another butterfly species that has such a coalition fighting for it to save it for extinction. It's really amazing working with all of these incredible people who are all dedicated to the same thing. So, John Ball Zoo, when we first started this partnership with him, they've jumped like head on right away. They were in, and they have been such fantastic partners to work with. Minnesota Zoo has been doing this for longer than we have. So really good working partnership with them, always bouncing ideas off of them. And then Assiniboine Park Zoo in Winnipeg is doing the same thing that we're doing with the populations in Manitoba. And so we work very closely with them and some of their partners. That's where the international part of the partnership comes in. We work extremely closely with Fish and Wildlife Service. We have to, if we're working with endangered species and permits and all of that. But also the majority of our funding for this program comes from Fish and Wildlife Service. And without that funding, if this project hadn't started in 2021, it would probably be too late. There wouldn't have been enough butterflies in 2022 to keep working with them. And so it's really fortuitous that we started in 2021, but Fish and Wildlife has been a consistent funding agency for this program. We also work extremely closely with Michigan Natural Features Inventory. We need to know what the butterflies are doing in the wild. We need to know what our butterflies are doing, and they're the ones that are out there surveying throughout the flight period. Michigan DNR also partners Springfield Township in Michigan, where the populations are located. They're doing all the habitat management. Like I could go on and on about all of our partners that are helping make this happen, but it's been an incredible partnership and so far. So great partners all around. And that's kind of all I have. Those are the programs that we've been working on. We're hoping that this year we'll expand what we've been doing for Mitchell Satyr and start getting those numbers up. And yeah, we've got a really exciting year ahead of us.
Thank you so much. That was a great presentation, really good information and also, really on topic for our members. So thank you. If you're okay, we're going to open it for questions.
Yeah,
So
love to answer any questions.
yeah, so if people want to unmute and ask a question, or if you can put a question in the chat. I'm just going to start with the first question. For the Poweshiek Skipperling, you showed your captive breeding between 2021 and 2022, and the caterpillar viability rate changed pretty dramatically, like 35 to 70 something. So just wondering, like, what did you change something in your process, or how did that?
Yeah. Yeah. So we had a few things that we tried that some of our partners like at Manitoba and Minnesota Zoo had been doing. So one of the things that we noticed is that when those caterpillars hatch, they are really, really tiny and they're really susceptible to desiccation. And I think what happened that first year was that they were probably getting a little too hot in our hoop house too early. It seems like once they're established on their plant and they start feeding and they get a meal, they get a lot of their water from the plant that they eat. And so one thing that we did was we started keeping the caterpillars for a day or two in our incubator where we incubate the eggs, but on their plants. And we can control the temperature and humidity. And we have it set at a really, reasonable, mild temperature around 75 degrees Fahrenheit, but really high humidity. And that allows those caterpillars to find where they're going to get set up on their plant, start feeding. And then after they've established, then we bring them out into our hoop house and use shade cloths to adjust the temperature where we want it. We also started occasionally misting the enclosures that the caterpillars are on in our hoop house just to keep that humidity a little higher, especially on some of those days where the humidity is low. And so that just helps raise that humidity a little bit, seems to really benefit those caterpillars. So I would say those are the two big things that we did. That first year we did have a feeling it was probably temperature related and humidity related. And, every year since then, our survival rate's been great. So we're hoping that that continues.
Great, thank you. If anyone else has a question, feel free to ask it.
David, what did you think the reason was for the decline of the Mitchell Satyr in Michigan?
Yeah, it's all the same as Poweshiek. So that slide that I gave for, habitat destruction, they're found in prairie fens. Prairie fens have decreased throughout the range. So that's a big one, that habitat. And so for them, altering that hydrology is especially important because the plants that they depend on the water. And so if you take that water away, we've had several prairie fens in Michigan disappear because of the altered hydrology, but also pesticides. It's a huge one. There's one really healthy population left in Michigan. They've done some pesticide sampling in historic sites and current sites. And right now, the site with the biggest population consistently has the fewest pesticides, the lowest concentration of pesticides. Those other ones had, higher elevated levels of pesticides. So that, I think it's really two things: habitat quality and pesticides right now is what's really hammering these butterflies.
Thank you.
Excuse me, David. What is the population like in the southern states and for the Mitchell Satyr?
Yeah, so they're doing pretty well in Mississippi and Alabama. There's actually we don't know a lot about those populations. They seem like they do still have some sort of metapopulation structure, unlike the butterflies in Michigan. But you can go out and see on a good day hundreds of butterflies out there. And that's hard to do now in Michigan outside of one site. They do use different habitat down there, so they are in much more, I would say, wooded, much higher overstory than in Michigan in those open prairie fens. They're much in much more closed areas, and those populations remind me a lot of the populations in North Carolina. If you had taken me and blindfolded me and dropped me in the Mississippi populations and said, "Where are you?" I would have said, "I'm at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, looking at St. Francis satyrs." Even the way that the butterflies look appears very similar to the butterflies in North Carolina and much, much different than the ones in Michigan. And we're doing the genetic work right now. We'll have the results any day, actually. They're almost ready. We're going to know if those how closely related these populations are. But if I had to guess, I would say those populations in the South in Mississippi, Alabama, and North Carolina are more closely related than they are to the Michigan ones. They look completely different to me, but they use different habitat. I mean, it won't surprise me if they're different subspecies at least.
Hmm. Can I ask a question for our longer term time members? When was the Mitchell Satyr extirpated from New Jersey, and where was it found? Does anybody know?
Yeah, that was 1986 was the last sighting. And they were really confined to fens in Warren and Sussex County. That was it.
Okay.
And of course, the reason for the extirpation was thought to be collecting, because obviously in '86 we weren't dealing with neonics.
Right. Thank you, Wade. And thank you, David. Oh, David, one other question. What is the host plant for the skipperling?
That is a good question. So we use prairie drop seed at our facility back when the populations were still doing pretty well. a few caterpillars were found in the wild in Wisconsin using prairie drop seed. But we also know that they have to be using something else out there too. We have populations in Michigan, or had populations in Michigan, where no one has ever seen prairie drop seed in those sites. And so we know they must be using something else. We don't know what that is. The populations are so low now that finding a tiny little green caterpillar in a prairie fen is like needle in a haystack. It's impossible. So we're thinking of ways that we could try to tease apart like what else they might be using, doing like a host plant study in our hoop house or something like that. But prairie drop seed works really well. They do very well on it. They must be using something else though.
Yeah. All right, thank you.
We do
David,
have-
what accounts for the loss of the hydraulics of the fen water tables?
Yeah, it could be a number of things. So construction, new construction, like grading roads can alter the hydrology if they're going through a wet area. I'm trying to think what else. Just like drilling for wells. I think construction is really the main source of altered hydrology. That's not as big of an issue now. These sites are protected, and like Fish and Wildlife Service is pretty much on top of that now. But in the past, yeah, we've lost sites because of altered hydrology, just from construction and yeah, altering the water table.
David, I just wanted to look up the sources for the host plant for the skipperling. And you probably know this, but in some sources they listed spike rush, Elaeocharis, as the host plant.
The reason for that is because somebody saw one laying an egg on spike rush. No one has ever seen them eating it. And we've seen the species laying eggs on other species of plants too, with no indication that the caterpillars can eat them. So that's an outdated source that is still out there on the internet. But we have no reason to believe they can eat that. Maybe they can, but nobody's ever actually confirmed it. And it's quite different structure than prairie drop seed too. I'd be surprised if they can eat that.
I have my dumb amateur question. Is there any chance of synthetically developing fens for Mitchell satyrs and others?
Yeah, that's a good question. I wish it was possible. I don't know of any way to do it. These fens are so unique. So I don't think there would be a way to do it, because the fen water that's found in these fens is very high in certain minerals. And so the plants that are associated with this, mineral rich groundwater is much different than any other wetland you might go to. And so there's really no way to recreate these, groundwater fed mineral rich fens that these plants and species depend on.
I thank you.
You can restore it, like if invasive species come in, like glossy buckthorn, you can take that out and use fire or other management practices to get rid of invasives. But once it's lost, once that water table is altered, there's no getting it back.
Okay, thank you so much.
David,
I have a question for you about the rearing process. So I know for like a lot of breeds, especially monarchs, experts advise against like home rearing because of issues with, like, obviously if they're not exposed to sunlight, there's an issue with migration or direction, like there's an issue with inbreeding, and just obviously just the worry that they're not going to integrate themselves with wild populations. Yeah. And a lot of that's probably because, people are doing it at home and aren't really taking precaution or measures for this. But was there anything that like you and the team had to think of in order to like prevent any of these concerns?
Yeah, so we have all of those same concerns, and that's why so when we started, this population was started with eggs from females that were collected in the wild. And so once those eggs come in, we track those females and their offspring every single year. So we know who laid what eggs and how closely related they are. So say we collected 10 females to start the program, all of those eggs are tracked. They're not mixed up. We track every one of those distinct genetic lineages so that we're not breeding brothers and sisters together, so that we're not getting that inbreeding depression that you talked about. And that slide that I showed for the genetic work shows that our animals are actually more genetically healthy than anything that's remaining in the wild. So if we weren't doing that, then yeah, there would be a major concern. But we very, very closely track that. And we have pedigrees and everything built out for every year for our breeding recommendations. Now that we've been doing this for several years, who is, you know, distantly related is getting harder and harder to figure out. So we're tracking that. We did wonder what our butterflies are doing. Are they acting wild? Are they doing what they should be after being raised in a hoop house for a year? And that's why we mark them and we track them throughout the fen to see what they're doing. We have evidence. We've seen them breeding with each other. We've seen them breeding with wild butterflies, and we've seen them laying those eggs. So it seems like they're doing everything they should be. We actually had just had recorded the longest dispersal movement of one of our butterflies that's ever been recorded for a Poweshiek Skipperling, because it was marked and because people are out there surveying. So, you know, we still worry about disease. If a disease gets in our facility, you know, we have we have things in place where we, you know, keep everything very clean and we disinfect things. But yeah, it's on a different level than, you know, rearing monarchs. Monarchs are relatively easy to rear if you just give them the food that they need. This species is really tough. And so we have to stay on top of all of that. But it seems like they're doing what they should be doing when we release them. They're integrating into the population, and, you know, they're non-migratory, so we don't have that to worry about. But we do rear them outdoors in the hoop house you saw. And so they get light, they get the natural daylight cycle, they get the temperatures that they should be getting. We have tried a little bit of rearing them indoors back in the early days, and it does not work well at all. It seems like these species, both Poweshiek and Mitchell's, really need to be reared outdoors, and they get some of their cues for when to go into diapause and how fast to grow from the temperature, but also those daylight cycles. And when the days get shorter, that's their cue to start going into diapause. So yeah, we think about all of these things. We probably think about it too much and stress over so many different things because of how rare they are. But yeah, we keep all of those things in mind. That's a great question.
David, another question about the fens. Are the fens in Michigan and Manitoba and the other places in the South on limestone, like our Jersey ones appear to be all limestone ones?
Yeah, they're not on limestone per se, but they have that kind of calcium rich water, and so maybe they are getting that from like a deep down aquifer bedrock or something like that, but there's not like exposed limestone around. And actually the prairie fens in Michigan that Poweshiek are using, they're not using prairie fens in Manitoba, so they're in the tall grass prairies out there. So that's like Michigan, they're using a little different habitat than the rest of the Midwest where their core of the population was. We don't know if it's just because they got pushed there from habitat loss and that's the only spot they can remain anymore, or if that's just naturally how they are. And that's
how about the Satyr fens?
The Satyr fens are very similar. So they're, you know, Mitchell's and Poweshiek used to be found in the same fens. They're pretty much the same thing, same habitat. The areas in the fens where Mitchell's use are wetter, and then the Poweshieks were found up like on the, you know, little drier hummocks within those same prairie fens, but they all have the same structure and components.
Thanks.
Hey. How can you keep the parasites?
Yeah, keeping out parasites.
Yes.
So luckily, it doesn't seem like Poweshieks have too many predators that want to parasite or to parasitize them, which is good. Unlike monarchs that but monarchs are also brightly colored. They're really big. and they're like very active and moving around and eating a lot and frassing a lot and attracting a lot of predators. The Poweshiek Skipperling and the Mitchell Satyr caterpillars are small and green. They blend in very well with the host plant. They don't move much. And so
Okay.
finding them when we have a little enclosure that's like this, and we know there's 3 in there, even just finding them is sometimes like nearly impossible just because they blend in so well.
Okay, thanks.
So we
Yeah.
also keep mesh covers over all of our enclosures that we do rear them. So we don't open those unless they're like a spider or something and the bottom needs to be taken out.
Oh,
These mesh covers are very, very fine mesh so the caterpillars can't get out, but also nothing can get in.
that's good. Thank you.
What was the food plant for the Mitchells again?
Carex stricta. So it's a type of sedge. It's an extremely common sedge in Michigan. It's found all throughout the prairie fens and really wet areas in general. It's extremely abundant, easy to grow, which is nice for me.
Is that what they're feeding on in the wild in
Yeah.
Mississippi and Alabama as
That's
well?
a great question. No, they are not.
No.
They don't, I don't think they even have Carex stricta in Mississippi and Alabama. So one of my big questions was, oh, I hope we didn't just bring these butterflies back and these caterpillars aren't going to eat the Carex stricta we're going to give them.
Right.
We use other species of sedges, and we did a host plant study for St. Francis Satyr in North Carolina. They ate everything we gave them and they did just fine.
Mhm.
And so we felt pretty comfortable that these would be the same. And yeah, they started eating it right away. They had no issues eating it. It seems like the satyrs, when it comes to the sedges, are pretty generalists. But again, these caterpillars are small and green and they're rare, and finding them in the wild is extremely difficult. So much of what we know is just based on a few observations of what caterpillars have been seen eating in the wild. But yeah, they don't eat Carex stricta in the south, but they do just fine on it.
Well, very lucky. Lucky that they're not picky.
Yeah.
That always raises an interesting question as to Carex stricta is probably the most abundant Carex in New Jersey, certainly. But why are the butterflies so rare when the food plant is so common?
Yeah, that's a good question. And like I said, we have one population in Michigan that's really healthy. It's like on peak survey days when the flight is at its best, the folks at Michigan Natural Features Inventory can record 400 or 500 butterflies in a survey. And that's incredible. But the rest, there's no other site that's like that. They're all very rare. So why is that one site doing well? Consistently has the fewest pesticides detected when they do pesticide screening. So it might be as simple as that.
Mm-hmm.
Any final question?
Excellent program.
Excellent
Right.
job.
Thank you.
All right. Well, hearing no more questions, thank you, David. That was a great presentation and great discussion. We really appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having me. I love talking about this stuff.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
I'm
Very
gonna
likely.
sign up on that
Thank you.
Facebook page for sure.
Thank you. Yeah,
Hopefully we'll have some good updates for you.
Yep.
thank
Like
you.
to hear about the genetics that result from that study in relation to the population that had been in New Jersey.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
I can't wait for that genetic data to come through because
Yeah.
when we collected the butterflies from the south and then brought the butterflies in from Michigan, I was like, these are totally different. They don't even look the same. They don't even use the same habitat. So we'll see if my intuition was right or not. But either way, it'll be really interesting.
Yeah, well, stay tuned.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you,
thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Have a good
You
night.
too, thank you.
Okay. So we're going to